Good morning. It is 11:49 a.m. on Sunday, June 11th, 2017. I'm Christiana Ellis, and this is 5 more minutes. Today, of course, Sunday, time for rewatch of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and today's episode is Season 3, Episode 2, The Headband. Named, of course, for the headband that Aang wears as he poses as Kuzan, Fire Nation student. I feel like that plot line in this episode is well-meaning but a little facile. Like things happen a little too easy. I like the concept, but it's not one of the stronger episodes there, I don't think. There's some interesting stuff happening, but I think that it's just like things go a little bit too smoothly, in my opinion. But there's some also great stuff happening over in Zuko's storyline. And of course, even when I say an episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender is not the strongest, that's really only in comparison to other episodes of this show, which are amazing. So it's not bad in any objective sense. But so let's go ahead and just talk through Aang's storyline here. It's interesting right off the bat that once they decide to go blend in, that they steal some clothes. And so first of all, obviously, they've been hiding in caves, and a couple of them conclude that that's probably not practical to continue hiding in caves. They'll be getting less information, and it's going to be harder on them. Although that whole sequence provides the fun example of these are enemy birds from Sokka. And Sokka is willing to go along, even though he's more on the voting of staying in the caves. But he does not object when he's outvoted. But in order to blend in, they're going to need some clothes, and so they decide to steal some. And there's some brief discussion about whether it's okay to steal them or not. And they conclude that it's necessary for a larger effort and a greater good. And so they make the excuse on that basis, which I don't object to, but it's an interesting contrast to season 1 episode Waterbending Scroll, where Katara stole that, the nominal waterbending scroll, and there was some discussion about whether it was right to steal it in the context there. Because, of course, I think the concern whenever you get into the idea that stealing is justified is that if you decide to draw the line somewhere that some stealing is okay, all of a sudden that becomes a negotiable thing. Like, well, how much do you need it? Well, it's... So I'm like, I think they made the right decision here, but it is just an interesting contrast with that episode where they seem much more at peace with it now. But of course, that's also, it's needed to be far more pragmatic now. The kids have matured somewhat through their adventures in that time. And they know more about what they're up against now. And I think it's also possible that there's an element where, but now they're stealing from Fire Nation people. But it's interesting because, of course, Aang is the one who is inclined in this episode to not want to see the Fire Nation people as all enemies. Katara and Sokka are much more inclined to think of themselves as now infiltrating an enemy nation, which is, to some extent true from one perspective, whereas Aang is more like, well, these are the people that we're going to want to have like us again after we defeat the Fire Lord. And Toph seems to be just going along to get along at this point, which, she's there to help, but like this part of the whole strategy of making these sorts of decisions is kind of not her forte, and she's fine to just let others make the decisions in that regard. But of course, Aang is the one that claims to know all of the current terminology and goes around calling everybody in the Fire Nation Hotman and saying things like Flameo. And it's obvious that he's kind of out of date. He mentions his friend Kuzan that he used to visit, but then once the soldiers recognize his school uniform, he's forced to go to school. He claims to be Kuzan, and so then we get like the main plot of this story, and it's kind of a little bit of like a Footloose retelling here, where it's like, what? You don't even dance? So let's have a little dance party in a cave. And I like it all in concept, and I think it's just an example of something that storyline, when condensed down to one half of a 22-minute episode, more like 2/3, I guess, is the split in this case. It just has to move so fast that things that would ordinarily need to have be built to have to just be assumed or shorthanded. So, Aang makes some friends, but then the local bully, picks on him. And there is a nice sequence where Aang defeats the bully without even ever having to touch him, but just by dodging around with his hands behind his back. No bending, no even real fighting. Like, he does not even really defend himself beyond refusing to let the other guy hit him. So he just keeps dodging and dodging and dodging until he is able to make the bully fall over on his own. And that's a pretty neat sequence. And we can see there's some aspects of what would make these other kids start to think of Aang as this appealing rebel who questions the teacher's propaganda in the history books and wants to dance even though he's told that that's improper. But they're all kind of interested there. And so that's where we get to this idea of, well, as Aang says, I think I've got the quote here. If we want to change things, like those kids at school are the future of the Fire Nation. If we want to change this place for the better, we need to show them a little taste of freedom. Which I think is good in concept, but it's also, you could make the argument that, nickel and diming one school in the whole nation, and the amount of time that you had to spend there, like, is that the most productive use of their time right now? Well, I think we can answer that by saying, well, no, but it's all tied up in Aang's desire to experience being like a normal kid, right? And we get the fun exchange where he's having this argument with Sokka, and Aang gets to kind of just says, you don't understand. You get to be normal all the time. And then Toph laughs at him, ha ha, which is kind of funny. But it's definitely, I think, well portrayed as something that is really probably not the best use of their time, even if it's well-meaning, because it's wrapped up in this desire from Aang to understand and feel what it's like to be a normal kid, instead of the destined hero who has to always be in danger and save the world and has that responsibility on his shoulders. And so it's kind of nice to see that. And it all culminates in this dance party in the cave where slowly but surely he gets people dancing and they seem into it and it's exciting. But then, of course, the soldiers show up because the bully told them off, and of course they did. And then we get to the bit where, like, I can buy that these kids who have never tried dancing might go out to this party and try it, but I can't help but think that it would be, like, in a more realistic type of story, there would be a lot more of them who would run away at when challenged. So this thing where suddenly they're all wearing headbands and all cheerfully defying the soldiers by allowing Aang to escape, it doesn't quite feel earned. Because it feels like for most of those kids, they only just started thinking that maybe this was okay. And so for them to actually defend him against soldiers, especially with this headband thing, which feels like it would have had to be prearranged, that's, it bugs me a little bit. So the whole I am Spartacus element to it feels a little cheap, which is a shame. I mean, it's a mild criticism. I like it in concept. It's just they didn't really have the time to support that storytelling move adequately. I do like the fun moment, though, of Aang thanking the kids and escaping, and got that one kid with the headband going, "Yeah, you go, Aang," and then Aang uses earthbending to close the cave behind him, and it's like, oh, what? So we can't help but wonder, like, what those kids would have thought, to discover that was actually the Avatar. Might have, I imagine it would have been a first reaction. Some would react differently than others. So that story it's relatively basic. Like, I feel like there's not a lot of broader implications to cover with that story. And it's fine, but it's just kind of too rushed to have any real weight to it. But what it's good for, at very least, is world building and showing us what it's like for more normal Fire Nation citizens. So that's good. In the meantime, I think we've got some meatier stuff happening over with Zuko, because we've got a couple of elements going on here. First thing that we see is we see Zuko having trouble sleeping, and then starting to make his way towards this big, ominous-looking building that we're not 100% sure what it is, but he's kind of trying to be sneaky, but then when a guard spots him, he just leaves. And it's only later when we discover, oh, that is the prison where Iroh is being held as a traitor. And so he's obviously having some trouble with everything that happened, right? We have him later go back to the prison and threaten a guard to let him, see Iroh and not tell anybody. But Iroh won't even look at him. Won't talk to him. Won't even look at him. Won't even make eye contact. And it's very hard to watch, because this relationship between Zuko and Iroh kind of hoping that he can shape Zuko into becoming a better man, only to have that trust betrayed, and now for Zuko to be coming back and pitching this as like, well, you did this to yourself, and we can understand that what's happening here is Zuko is finding that getting everything he wanted is not satisfying, and he is feeling troubled about what he had to do to get there. And in particular, Iroh, who he trusted and who had his back so many times, he knows he had to betray him. And so he's essentially trying to get Iroh's permission to think it's okay. He's trying to convince, like, if Iroh can forgive him for what he did, then obviously for what he did is okay. And so we can see him having that struggle of not wanting to be wrong, but feeling in his heart like maybe he is, and so therefore trying to get the person who thinks he's wrong to say that he's not, so that he can feel better about it. But of course, Iroh is not going to give him that, because he's not wrong, or he's not right. He was wrong to do what he did. And we can see it too, how hollow everything Zuko has supposedly been given is. But for him to challenge Iroh in that way and try to bully Iroh into telling him that he did the right thing, we can obviously see Iroh's not going to grant an inch there. But then, of course, we get another visit later where now this is like the stages of grief in a way for Zuko. He's saying, okay, well, that didn't work, so I'll try being nice this time. I'll bring him some food, and I'll admit that I'm feeling a little bit of confused, and I need help. I need advice, like he's always given me, and like he's always been happy to help me with. And I'll admit that I need that help and try to be nicer, but Iroh still won't look at him. And I think we can recognize that it's because it's still ultimately the same thing. He is not looking for real advice. He is looking for Iroh to give him permission to feel okay about what he did. And Iroh's going to basically say, you don't get to betray everything that I tried to teach you and then still ask me to teach you more things. But he doesn't say anything. He just doesn't even look. But we can see this time when Zuko blows up and leaves that this is harder on Iroh, because Iroh, of course, does still love Zuko and hates seeing this happen, but just it's so hard. It's so hard. And then, of course, we have in the meantime that this little blossoming relationship that we saw on the ship back to the Fire Nation. Zuko and Mai have seems to have they're seeing each other now. I feel like that happens a little quickly, but I don't object. It's just some. We can certainly read between the lines and imagine this has kind of been building slowly. And of course, we know from even the flashback episodes that Mai's had kind of a crush on Zuko, like since they were kids. But it's what's interesting here is that they're trying to have this private moment and they share a kiss, but then Azula shows up, and Azula, it's increasingly transparent to both Zuko and Mai that Azula is showing up at this point, probably on purpose when they were having alone together, because it's kind of her thing that nobody is allowed to have anything that doesn't involve her. And so she, Azula, has the loyalty of Ty Lee and Mai, but she also kind of expects them to not have anything else in their lives. She wants them to be dependent on her alone. And so even though she has this other ulterior motive of talking to Zuko, interrupting the date is so transparently on purpose that even Mai recognizes it. And so even when, Azula says, oh, Ty Lee needs help untangling her braid, Mai is willing to say, oh, of course, I'll go help her right away. But we see her give Azula a look as she leaves, which feels a little significant. But also earned in the sense that, Azula is kind of being a crappy friend, even if we want to argue that, being on the wrong side of history is a whole other thing. But just this idea of, not only do I expect you to support me in all things, but I expect you to not have anything else in your life except for that. And so we can definitely see Mai annoyed with that. It's such an obvious move. It's not as subtle as Azula thinks it is. But of course, neither is her move for Zuko, which is to say, I have found out that you're going to see Iroh. And she's basically playing on his, she's basically saying, oh, don't you think that if you were to be found out, visiting a traitor, don't you think that would be suspicious? And it's kind of this, the veil is slipping a teensy bit in the sense that she plays it as, oh, I'm just looking out for you. I wouldn't want there to be an appearance of you actually scheming with Iroh, so I'm just trying to help. But at this point, it's too obvious what she's really like, so it's very transparent that this is more like a passive-aggressive threat of, you better stop doing that, or else I will tell people you're scheming with him. And so that's, frustrating for Zuko to kind of be dealing with that passive-aggressive stuff coming from Azula, and also being annoyed about the interrupted date. But so almost and that's of course where he, this is where Zuko had attempted to go and be nicer to Iroh, which still doesn't work. And so, because Iroh refuses to give Zuko the absolution he wants, he even smashes this food that he brought him against the wall. And it's very frustrating, and Zuko is really upset. And Iroh's upset too, and it's because, Zuko is kind of wanting forgiveness without admitting that he did anything wrong. But we also know that the reason he's asking is because in his heart he does know he did something wrong, and he's not willing to admit it, and it's like, oh. Okay. Anyway, though, so the last we see though here is we think that we think at first that maybe Zuko is going to see Iroh again and that he's going to be interrupted by someone, but then we see it's actually a different meeting altogether. And so in order to be sure that the Avatar is not going to be found to be alive and bring everything crashing down on Zuko, he hires what seems to be an assassin to go find and kill the Avatar. This guy with the, beard and a tattoo of a sideways red eye on his forehead, and what looks like a metal arm. And so that's kind of cliffhanger of like, ooh, he's sending someone after the Avatar. But it is after the whole arc of Zuko in seasons 1 and 2. This period, I think, is absolutely, like, he would have thought that being on the run, like when they were actually having to, beg for or steal food on the run and looking ratty and having to pretend he's not who he is, he really is. Like, Zuko might have told himself that was rock bottom, but I think what we see now is that this is where he's actually getting close, because he's discovering that the things he thought that he wanted are all hollow and fragile. And so he's still struggling to hold them together. And it's a sinking ship, and it's upsetting. So, in any case, we will continue next week with the 3rd episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And in the meantime, I will talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.